Hi everybody, welcome to Talking Automotive with Mark and John. My name's John Sinclair and my co-host Mark Padavestra.
Hi John, today we've got a special guest, Dave Opsahl. Dave shares information around software solutions for OEMs and suppliers to the OEMs in the US market, but also covers the global side of things. And it's a real opener into pressures that are in place for suppliers to OEMs, not just from a quotation and getting inventory to them on a just-in-time basis, but also the other challenges around getting staff, the challenges with EV, and the silicon chip shortages.
Dave covers a big part of the future of automotive and how it's going to deal with some of the changes happening as we move to electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. So let's jump into it.
If you like what you hear today, remember to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Ring the bell down below so you'll get updates with new videos. Follow us on Spotify, iTunes, and our website, autocurrents.com.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services is an independent division of Precar Services, offering specialty fleet fit-outs for commercial applications ranging from simple tray and tow bar fitments to fully bespoke service body and accessory installation. With quality-assured safety, compliance and standardisation of vehicle builds, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies, and original equipment manufacturers. For further information on how Precar Fleet Services can assist in solving your commercial vehicle fit-out needs, please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Modera is a cloud-based, AI-powered CRM and retail platform aimed at digitizing the physical process of selling a car. The Modera platform sits between existing automotive dealer and OEM systems, providing car dealerships a quick and easy shift to digital ways of working, all done entirely digitally and with total ease.
Dave, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us. To start things off, can you maybe just tell us a little bit about Actify and what you do?
So we're a software company that works with what we would call technical information, mostly design information. Most of the 1,500 plus companies that license our software are automotive suppliers. And what they do with it is those suppliers use different systems to design the components and assemblies that their customers, the OEMs or the manufacturers are looking for. And, for them to be able to be familiar with all those different systems just doesn't work very well. And so we have a way of being able to take that, allow them to bring it into a common format so that they can work with it in an environment they're comfortable with and not lose any of the detail that is coming in that information. And a lot of that information is very rich and very dense. So it's not just geometrically, what does the thing look like and how does it measure out, but what are the manufacturing properties to it? What are the tolerances that have to be held to it and that sort of thing. So we deliver that software to them. And we also historically have delivered a piece of software that helps them manage all of the data that's coming their way, being able to make sure they can keep configuration control of it and that sort of thing. We've expanded into helping them go a step above that and manage what are called automotive programs. So, when a company decides to introduce a new model, they, go out to a network of suppliers, they ask for, bids on, what it's going to take to be able to deliver X number of these things over a certain period of time at some cost. They award that to someone, and then that starts a process called an automotive program where the manufacturer who's building that piece has to figure out over a period of about 6 to 9 months, can I really make this at the price I quoted? So that's kind of the scope of what we're doing at Actify.
I was just keen to ask Dave, dealing with the suppliers and being that connects the conduit between the OEM and the suppliers, how do you end up in that space?
Well, it's an interesting story. The first piece of software that we developed when the company started years ago was just a very simple application that would live on any PC, a laptop or a desktop, where you could receive this CAD data, computer-aided design data coming from the OEM, and have a very easy way to be able to bring it into a very simple application and let you evaluate it. You could measure it, you could cut sections through it, you could do a lot of those kind of things. Eventually, what happened was a number of those companies started asking us to say, we're getting a lot of this information, we're having trouble managing it. Can you do something that will help us with that? And that started about 6 or 7 years ago. And a couple of years ago, just a little over 2 years ago, companies started coming and asking us, could you add this to that piece of software that was managing all of this? We'd like you to extend it to do this. And we started building those on a customer per customer basis. And after a while, we looked at that and said, hang on, this is all looking very similar. It's just different in terms of the words that they use, or maybe there's a slight difference from A to B here. That sort of screams there's a need for a solution here. So we started interviewing customers. We talked to about 24 suppliers. And we asked them, why are you asking for this? What's really the business reason behind this? Don't talk to us about the technology. And what we realized is that this difference in the way that the automotive industry works. If I'm a bicycle manufacturer, from the time I decide that I think there's a market opportunity for me to introduce a new model, I'm in complete control of everything. I decide what the design's going to be, what the price is going to be, who my suppliers are, when I'm going to introduce it, where, all of that is up to me. The automotive industry is the exact opposite. If I'm Ford or BMW, I go to my supplier and I say, here's the thing I'd like you to produce. And this is an industry fact. They know this. Oftentimes they're given 2 weeks to come back with an answer with that quote that says, all right, here's my commitment. This is what I'll charge you. This is based on what you've given me. This is what I'll produce for you over that period of time. The only thing is the manufacturer, the supplier, hasn't had enough time to really sit down and answer all those questions. What is it going to take to do this? How much is it going to cost to get the tooling produced? Where am I going to build it? All of that gets done over a period of about 6 to 12 months. And that period is what's called managing the program. So you've got this person that's sitting in charge of this thing who has no authority, but has complete responsibility for getting this thing out the door on time and on budget. And yet they're managing all of this with spreadsheets. So there's a study that we've done that I'm happy to share with you that talks about just how ridiculous this situation is, where you have this critical function and you've got people chasing information on an hourly basis, trying to communicate with all the stakeholders going, this is the status of this program, this thing that we've got going, and reporting back on that to the customer, to their executives, to the manufacturers. So we made a decision 2 years ago to go build something on purpose to solve that specific problem. And that's what we launched last June. That's how I guess you could say in a way we stumbled into it, but I like to think we earned our way into it.
That is a fantastic story. So that's a real classic case of customer has problem, needs solution. You are working with them on other products or other solutions, and you then develop a product that helps them ultimately help consumers. Currently, we're seeing a shortage of vehicles in many markets, and we're seeing it very much here in Australia, and I dare say it's happening in the US. We're seeing wait times for new vehicles of at least 6 months or more. And the reason for this is the chip shortage. Are you able to give us some background on what's created the chip shortage and how's it going to get resolved?
I'm actually personally impacted by that because a couple of weeks ago, I put in an order for a new pickup and I'm having to wait 6 months for it from General Motors. So I know the problem. There's a couple of things about the chip shortage that generally don't get talked about. So one of them is there's two kinds of chips. There's the chips that an automotive manufacturer might ask to have made for them that are specific to what they want to do. So it's a custom or an ASIC is what it's called, application specific. That's not really where the problem has been. A lot of what's in modern vehicles today with the electronics and the software that's in there needs the use of chips that you could find in almost any consumer hard good, an appliance, or any consumer electronics. And so what happened in the automotive industry was that when the pandemic first hit, the assumption was that there was going to be a slowdown in purchasing. And so customers cancel, the OEMs, the manufacturers, or their suppliers, depending on, who's actually the point of purchase, would cancel the orders based on that reduction in demand. And the problem is that when situation turned out to be exactly the opposite, was that when you cancel an order like that, you now go to the back of the line. If you are having something custom made for you, that line's really short. But if you are looking for integrated circuits or other components that are stock catalog items that are used across a number of industries, that line gets really, really long. And the lead time is not what it would be for other common components like screws or other fasteners, things like that you would use that can be made pretty quickly. There's months of lead time required to do that. So basically, it's a problem of them going to the back of the line. The automotive industry generally is not used to that. The suppliers to the automotive industry that build most of the physical components, drivetrains, body panels, the tooling that goes behind them, they're captive to the OEMs. They tend to deal most of the business that they do with those automotive manufacturers. And so there's a very different dynamic, the relationship between suppliers and the automotive manufacturers. And they're not used to having to compete with cell phone companies and, washing machine manufacturers for, the components that they need. So that's kind of the history behind that from what we've seen.
And whereabouts are the chips made, Dave?
The bulk of them, are made overseas. There's a fair portion of them that are also made in certain U.S. factories for some of those common components. There's not a tremendous amount of them that are made in Europe. That's also part of it. If you were to think about Asia as being two separate places, you've got Taiwan, which has a large number of semiconductors. China proper doesn't have a lot of those. So they're also placing demands on those for things that they're making. It's a limited supply.
So Taiwan seems to be the epicenter of a lot of interest for everybody.
Yeah, for a lot of reasons.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Dave, in Australia, we're seeing a lot of labour and technical skills shortages. Do you think this is a growing global trend? And do you think it will expand more in the future?
It is. So in the last 90 days, I've visited something like 30 of our automotive supplier customers in and around the greater Detroit area. And that is something we have heard in every single one of the places that I've been. Some of the stories I can share with you are one manufacturer that I visited not long ago was describing a situation where the CEO, this is a fairly large company, the CEO, his staff, a lot of the leadership in the company, they park their work clothes on Friday, and on the weekends they're down building parts. Because they can't get enough employees to be able to do that. How many of those people quit for certain reasons, I don't know, but the fact is that there is a labor shortage there. One of the problems that we also heard in more than one place is that in trying to hire new people, one of the things that they do, as you would expect, is they ask them to pass a drug test. And they're actually finding that a lot of people aren't able to pass a drug test, and they're not testing for marijuana. They're testing for other things. So there's a real shortage of qualified people, even at the lower skill levels, being able to come in and take some of those positions. It's really interesting to drive through 3 states in the US where you find most of these suppliers, and all of them have banners outside talking about hiring. Wages have gone up more than 20%, offering wages. They're offering hiring bonuses of several $1,000s. We're seeing situations where people will go to work for one supplier, and within 3 months, they go to the next one because they're able to get an increase in pay and a bonus for hiring. So I think that's going to continue for a while until there tends to be a shortage of jobs and an overabundance of applicants, and we're just not seeing that.
Here in Australia, we've had international borders being closed. So a lot of the transient workers aren't here. So that's why we've got a labour shortage. So in the US, your borders have been open. Is it because there aren't people coming in to fill those roles, or is it just that people don't want to do those roles anymore?
Well, the borders aren't all that open. Actually, there was, up until very recently, there was a complete moratorium on non-essential travel between Canada and the US, for instance. And I think the issues we have at the border with Mexico are probably, pretty well known. So there's been really not much in the way of transient labor that as far as I can see, that's been working in either one of those places. So it's really had a huge impact on the suppliers, the cost of what it is that it's taking them to produce something they quoted a year ago, or maybe even 2 years ago, and forcing them to go back to the customers, the automotive manufacturers, and say, how are we going to deal with this? Nobody saw that coming.
That's incredible. So we're seeing more industrial action being undertaken now in the US. Do you think this could spread globally to other markets? And what can the auto sector and companies do to circumvent that?
We haven't seen much in terms of labor actions in the automotive industry. We haven't seen much of that at all here. The focus, at least in the US media, on labor actions tends to be around things that are happening in the trucking, the logistics side of things, or at the ports. There's quite a bit of a shortage of drivers, for instance. So one of the things that has impacted the industry is that they simply can't get goods from one place to the next because of a shortage of drivers. Another thing that we've heard, and you've probably seen in Australia, is just the backup of ships waiting to offload containers. In a lot of cases, customers that we have, the suppliers, have had tooling that might have been manufactured in China that is still sitting on a boat, unable to be put into a factory to start to produce the products that they need for certain models. So that's a story we've heard in more than one place. As far as strikes are concerned, we haven't seen much any of that at all. And whether or not we start to see it over here is something I don't have a good feel for right now.
Dave, you spoke about the chip shortages. Do you think there's going to be any other types of shortages that OEM and OEM suppliers should be aware of? And is there anything they can do to circumvent that?
Well, I think, we all know there's a big push towards electrification and electric vehicles. And I think that one of the things that is been interesting to watch is that a lot of the battery cell technology that's out there today depends a lot on rare earth minerals, for instance. And China tends to have the control over most of the world's supply of rare earth minerals. So I think that there's the potential for the cost of those to have a dramatic impact on the cost of the vehicles that we end up buying. We're not seeing much, or I haven't seen much from our side in any other raw material. What we're seeing more often are changes in the price of things. And sometimes it's things that would just surprise you. So for instance, one of our customers is one of the top 5 auto suppliers by size worldwide. And they have a division that focuses entirely on exteriors. So, they're building the fascia, the sheet metal parts, the tooling that goes along for those, the bumpers, that sort of thing. One of the things that they have in the composite parts that they make is you need resin to be able to get something to cure into a hardened state. They saw a 7-fold increase per gallon in the price of resin when they could get it. And this particular company gets 6 semi-trucks a day full of resin. So you start to look at the magnification of the cost of something at a 7x. And if you have that in multiple places in the construction of that vehicle, the cost can add up pretty dramatically. But, it's the cost and it's the availability. Because it's one of those things, I'm sure you and your listeners are familiar with the Toyota production system. Things that happen just in time. There's no stock anywhere. Things arrive only when they're supposed to. Parts get sequenced to be available just when the production line needs them. And so trying to figure out how to navigate that sort of slop in the supply chain is something that's been very new for them to have to deal with in the last 18 months or so. So we're going to see more of that.
Dave, how do companies manage through that process? Because they would have quoted for those jobs maybe 2 years ago, and now their costs have gone up 7-fold. Who bears the cost of that? Can they pass on some of that to the OEM?
So this gets to kind of the unique nature of the relationship between OEMs and the suppliers. So one of the things that comes out of this relationship is that there's a limited number of suppliers that can actually produce certain kinds of things. Like if we think of the exteriors company I was talking about before, there are several other, but there's not a lot of them. There's only a few of them. And if that's a significant part of their business, they only have a few customers that they can do business with. And so what tends to happen is that there's a lot of risk that gets shoved down into the supply chain from the OEM customers because they have this captive supply chain that doesn't do a lot of business in other places. And that gives them a certain amount of leverage when it comes to talking about price. And so it almost is individual. So for instance, in talking to a lot of these suppliers, we know that there are some of the OEM manufacturers that tend to collaborate more when exceptions like this happen. And they sit down and try to negotiate out who's going to absorb what part of this. And then there are others that simply say, look, we have a contract with you that says that you agreed to produce these many of these things over this period of time. And I'm really sorry, but you're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. Now, at some point, that becomes an unsustainable argument. It's like, they have to come to some kind of agreement. But I think the nature of those relationships has to change. To get to your question about how can they deal with this, what can they do differently? One of the things that doesn't exist in that Toyota production system kind of just-in-time process is the idea of something called buffer stock. So stock that sits somewhere, which means that it's inventory on somebody's balance sheet. That stock sits somewhere, but can be used to absorb some of these kinds of shocks when they come in. That means renegotiating that relationship. And I think that mostly on the OEM side, they're going to have to learn to be a little bit more accommodating and flexible because they can't put all of that on the supplier, or they're going to put them in a situation of either losing money or not making any money. And that's not sustainable either.
Dave, you just outlined a situation that John and I've worked in a couple of OEMs through our time in this industry. And that situation that you just described, I have seen on a number of occasions. It's the procurement departments in the OEMs have got KPIs that are, it must be cost down at every negotiation. And when you think of that KPI, and it actually goes against the performance of the procurement people to actually accept a price increase. So, and what we've seen over the journey is a number of suppliers just go out of business, which ultimately hurts the OEM because you then have less suppliers when you go to market to negotiate with for that component. And then all you need is someone else to say, well, I'll have that component ahead of you. And then you get pushed to the back of the line. And next thing you've got your tail between your legs, or you can't supply a car and the factory stopped.
Exactly.
So It is. I can hear what you say, the need for OEMs to be good business partners. And it's interesting, the successful OEMs seem to be the ones that are good business partners with their customers, their dealers, but also their suppliers, and not trying to slow the suppliers down.
It's fairly consistent from supplier to supplier as to which of the OEMs tend to be more accommodating of that kind of relationship and which tend to be less that way. And we won't get into any of those names.
No. Now, we talked about EVs. Now, EVs are coming. It's a fact of life. And then it's now starting to gain a lot of momentum, that we're now getting past the niche. It's starting to get into mainstream, more mainstream in the US and in Europe than say, here in Australia at this stage, but it's coming. So with that rapid expansion of EVs, what does that mean to the manufacturers? And more importantly, I always feel for the suppliers, because we had a podcast actually just last week where we looked at how many components are in an internal combustion vehicle versus how many components are in a EV. And, suddenly gearboxes and radiators and all the other bits and pieces you don't need anymore. So there's a whole heap of componentry that doesn't need to be made anymore or supplied. What do you see, and what challenges do you see with that EV in an introduction or phasing in from the suppliers, and how are the suppliers dealing with that?
I look at it in kind of two different ways. One of them is that the componentry change, the content change in the vehicle is obviously, the number one thing. It's a huge thing. And, in certain places, like, for instance, within Germany, you have a specialization in precision manufacturing. In that area of the world, there's more of that done at that level than any place else that I know of. And they're quite good at it. They've got the tooling in place for it. And all of a sudden now, depending on the volume of EVs that are produced, and I'll come back to that here in the second piece, they could be in a world of hurt. and some of them already are. Where do you all of a sudden move then to a different industry to be able to take those same skills, those same production capabilities, the assets? Where do you go from there? And I don't think there's any clear answer to that. The other side of it that I look at is, and this is interesting because I think Australia and the United States have a similar situation here that's not the case in Europe. And so I'll come back to that. And that has to do with all fine and well that the automotive manufacturers are making a push towards electric vehicles. So you've got GM, for instance, it's talking about going all electric. Volkswagen, Audi is doing the same kind of thing. And that's good. But how many of them will sell over what period of time depends on a couple of other things that I don't hear talked about very much. I live in a very rural part of the United States. It's in the central part of a state called Oregon. That exceed the range of any electric vehicle that's on the market, and I would have no opportunity to be able to recharge and be able to do that. And that's true about a lot of the Western U.S. I don't know to what degree it's true in the eastern side, probably less so, but it's still, we have a history of having things spread out over great distances. I suspect that's probably true, in Australia too, unless you're around a larger city where you can do that. So there's an infrastructure need that's got to get built out that I know is already being built out much more in Europe than it is in the United States. There's a decision by the automotive manufacturers to go to EVs, and then there's the question of how rapidly will they sell. So the other side of that equation for instance, the precision part manufacturers is the fact that there's a lot of movement towards EVs does not necessarily mean that the tapering of the production of some of those components is going to be rapid. It's going to occur over a period of time. They're going to have an opportunity to adjust. So they can do things like think about, there's a lot of advancement now in being able to do mass production of 3D printed parts. It has a lot of advantages in terms of material costs, manufacturing costs, and savings. They'll have time to look at those new technologies and figure out if they can adapt to doing something different that maybe accommodates those electric vehicles. But I don't see the drop off in the production of internal combustion happening as rapidly as some people do. But that might be just my US bias.
Dave, in terms of the future for automotive, you're seeing new technologies such as autonomous cars coming. We're not quite sure how long it will take or what still needs to be done in that area. But where do you see the future of automotive, and what impact will those sort of technologies have on automotive?
Well, I think we talked already about just the nature of the relationship between suppliers and their OEM customers has to change. That's a given. I personally think the jury is still out, if I can use that expression, on autonomous vehicles. I really am not sure how rapid, if ever, that's going to take off. There's been some stories in the US recently about places where you have Tesla drivers that have gotten into accidents because they're in the back seat letting the car drive itself. I mean, there's a lot of questions, I think, still about what the efficacy of autonomous driving is going to be and how much we're willing to trust that to software. And software in those vehicles has to be built to standards that generally don't exist in any place other than aircraft and space vehicles. I think the future is still bright. People are not going to be, getting rid of vehicles anytime soon. There's a lot of cost attached to mass transportation if people wanted to try to propose that as a solution. And it doesn't work for countries like the US and Australia, where you've got, these huge expanses you've got to transit. It's just a lot easier to keep producing diesel trucks. Maybe they'll be electric one day, but I just don't see it happening as quickly as I think a lot of people are predicting.
It's interesting, Dave, a very profound statement is we overestimate the short term, but underestimate the long term. So there's a lot of talk about everything changing. All of a sudden now, within 5 years, we'll be driving all in EVs. Whereas in reality, it might be by 2050, once we phase out, there'll still be internal combustion vehicles on the road. The percentage will be lower. It's an interesting point you raise around the time for the other suppliers to pivot to do and look for other markets for their products. Now, one question I was going to ask you, the suppliers to the OEMs, do they supply the aftermarket as well? Because we see the aftermarket is a huge, vehicles are on the road for between 10 and 20 years. So there's a large need for panels, for crashes, for engine components, for transmission components, etc. How big a business is that for the suppliers?
That's a good question. And it's not one I have a good answer for, actually. There are several suppliers I've spoken with that I know are in the aftermarket business. But if I were to look across the customers that we have that are supplying products to new vehicles, to new programs, I don't know what the extent of their aftermarket business is, because we're generally, talking about those newer programs that are coming in and trying to figure out how to help them do that better. The aftermarket exists. You don't have any of those pressures. The pressures are considerably different. So, inventory is expected to be held. You don't have a just-in-time thing working for you in that scenario. It's more about what stock level do I want, and demand tells me, and it's fairly consistent. The demand's fairly consistent there. I would think that that's a place for them. But the other thing I think is that if I were to think about the aftermarket side of it, it's less about the drivetrain specifically than it is more about the other parts that, will get taken out either in a crash or just out of wear, suspension components and, things of that nature.
And thank you for joining us on the show. It's great to learn about what your business does and the importance of what you do, given that you can bring information to suppliers and OEMs and have that flow of detail with accurate data for quality decision-making purposes to speed up the introduction of products into the supply chain. So that's really powerful, because supply chain, John and I worked in OEMs for many years, and that's always been the biggest pain point when you say, oh, no, we did bring something in. Oh, forget it, that's 12 months away. But you've got a solution that you can actually cut that time down with accuracy and minimize any errors in specification and quotations for that. So that's really terrific. So it's a very powerful business solution that you provide to OEMs and to suppliers. And we know the suppliers are the backbone of the OEM industry. Everyone sees the brands that we buy, but ultimately those brands would not exist or would not be able to provide the products without the suppliers doing what they do in a cost-effective and efficient, timely way. And we talked about the just-in-time manufacturing process. There's a lot of pressure on suppliers to get product to that assembly line, right product, right spec, right time, right quality. So it's huge. So you've got a very important piece in that. So when we look at the OEMs actually have captive suppliers. So there's not a lot of suppliers that they supply to. And this is where we then have the problem of the silicon chips, where we have the chips that are custom made for the OEM industry. No supply issues there because they're on a fairly short assembly line. But it's the mainstream chips that are found in all sorts of electrical items that are the problem. Now, you talked about the concentration that's primarily in Taiwan, which, no surprise, there's a lot of interest in Taiwan right now from a whole heap of reasons. But also just that the supply of those chips, OEMs aren't used to competing with other industries for supply of stock or inventory. So this is where we have the situation that certain parts they can get, the mainstream bits they can't. So then we looked at the other bits about, okay, so EVs are coming, and then there's this shortage. Whilst we're talking about shortage of chips, there's shortage of skilled labour, because the industry is getting, there are other industries that are attracting the qualified and skilled people. So therefore, auto has traditionally been a less sexy industry in the modern age. It was very sexy in the Henry Ford days, but 100 years later, there are other industries that draw people to it. So we've got skills shortages. But at the same time, we've got the skill shortages. We've got industrial action on the waterfront. So we've got, because we rely on moving a lot of products internationally and components, we're getting holdups at the wharves in the US. We're getting it here in Australia and also Singapore, et cetera. So there's a problem there. And then there's industrial action, because suddenly there's a lot of work being done and they're realizing that they can actually flex a bit of muscle because there's a lot of demand for their services. Then we talked about the other challenges that are coming, and we talk about rare earth metals, and that sort of was a segue into the EV development. So, we've got a lot of the rare earth metals are controlled by China. So no surprises, China lead the way with battery development and production. But that's then leads to other challenges going forward. As electrification gains momentum, we're going to have challenges with, well, okay, where can we get this stuff from? And John, you gave us some insights as to the challenges to where you got to mine this stuff, because it's actually quite harmful to the environment to get this stuff. So that's a miners to the great story of EVs. And then we talked about EVs and how they're coming. But Dave, you mentioned that they're not going to come at the fast rate that we're all predicting or that we're expecting. A lot of the commentaries around it's going to be here tomorrow. And that's going to give the manufacturers time to pivot to other industries and other products, because the auto suppliers are very highly skilled. They are very, very technical, but their skill sets can be adapted across to other industries. And it's great that a lot of them are looking at that. But you also mentioned that the ones that are probably at greatest risk would be, say, in the German market, where there's a high focus on the precision items that go into the internal combustion drivetrains, or powertrains, engines, transmissions, etc., because they're very good at what they do, but those technologies will disappear. A lot happening in that area. And then you talked about, where do we go? Well, good automotive manufacturers use your products, because that's how they stay relevant and they can stay up to date. So thank you for coming on the show. Hopefully I've given your story justice in that summary.
I'm just grateful for a chance to chat with you all. It's interesting to think that we're half a world apart, and yet we're seeing a lot of the same things, asking a lot of the same questions. And I'm just grateful for a chance to share some of those things with you and learn what you've seen.
Thank you for listening. Hopefully you got as much out of today's episode as John and I did. It is a real opener into the supply chain at the back end of how vehicles are made and the challenges around that and the technologies to assist that.
If you enjoy what you heard, ring the bell below and subscribe to our channel. You can also follow us and like us on LinkedIn, and you can download our audios off Spotify and iTunes. And you can also get more information on our website, autocurrents.com.